Hello, and welcome to the GeoCurrents lecture series on global demography. This is lecture number 8 in the series, and it's going to look at depopulation in the Americas, North and South America, after 1500. And then at the end, it's going to turn to global population trends in the Little Ice Age. So I believe I showed this slide at the end of the previous lecture as one of many graphs showing global population over the years. These are all very tenuous data in all of these. But what we see highlighted here is a modest increase in global population growth from 1450 to 1650, and then kind of a plateau. What it doesn't show, though, are regional differences, and it certainly doesn't show the fact that much of the world, a very large portion of it, saw massive depopulation from 1500 to 1600. And that would be North and South America. When we look at maps like this is taken from a very interesting and useful animation of global population. I mentioned it before, where each yellow dot indicates 1 million people. I do have some problems with this, and most importantly, I believe it's severely underestimating the population of the Americas. So if you just count up the dots in Mesoamerica, that would be the region from central Mexico to northern Central America. I count 9 million with our 9 dots. The best current population estimates of this region would be 15 to 35 million. Or for the Andean realm, the Andes Mountains and Plateaus and coastal zone of Peru and Ecuador, into northern Chile. It has 7 dots there, 7 million current population estimates for the Inca Empire alone, 10 to 12 million, and some estimates up to 20 million. Same with the Amazon basin. There are no dots there, so it would indicate less than 1 million people. And this goes with the traditional view that Amazon basin, largely covered by rainforest, was pretty much a pristine wilderness with a few scattered populations of agricultural people. Made a lot of their living by hunting and gathering as well. But that seems to be a much more recent development that came after the depopulation. Now, the map in the same series from 1600 is much more accurate, showing only 3 million in both Mesoamerica and the Andean realm, indicating, or showing it anyway, the massive depopulation that followed. So I'll start here with Mesoamerica as a map of the Aztec Empire. Actually, more properly, the Empire of the Triple Alliance, the Mexica or Aztec being the most powerful of 3 city-states that formed this empire. And it only really formed in the 15th century, so it was not a long-lasting polity. Now, there had been a great many city-states, other sorts of states and empires in this region for a long period of time, but the city-state was the more common form of organization. And the Aztecs and their allies were to create this very powerful empire. It's really interesting looking at the map of this, in the geopolitics of this empire. You could see it has some sort of holes in it. It wasn't totally a contiguous empire. You can see a separate area in the east, and then you can see actually very close to Tenochtitlan, the capital. You can see the lake where it's located. You see a place called Tlaxcala. Tlaxcalan polity or state was very much the enemy of the Aztecs. In fact, the Aztecs, or the Triple Alliance, had a vast number of enemies because it was an empire constructed on the basis of brutality and terrorism. This was common of many empires. We've talked about that with the Roman Empire, Mongols, and others. The Aztec Empire was no different. And in fact, one of the things they did was to engage in massive human sacrifice. I mean, human sacrifice was common in the region, but it reached a new level under the Aztecs, and cities-states that refused to submit would be conquered and have, in some cases, tens of thousands of their people sacrificed. So anyway, it's often still said that some 1,000 to 1,500 Spanish troops under Cortez defeated this mighty Aztec empire. And it's important to note that the city of Tenochtitlan was larger than any city in Europe, except perhaps Constantinople or later Istanbul at the time, certainly bigger than anything in Spain. But it was not this relatively small number of Spanish troops with their swords and armor and cannons and war dogs and horses and everything else they had. They did by no means defeated this powerful empire alone. They had vast number of indigenous allies. So as this illustration from an article says, yeah, Tlaxcalan aid was crucial to Cortez's conquest. Yes, indeed. Here's the Wikipedia's current tally of the number of belligerents. And you could see you have this Spanish Empire against the Triple Alliance, but actually one important component of that alliance had actually gone over to the Spanish side. So it was down to two of the allies. And you see the total strength on the right with the 900 to 1,300 Spanish infantry and about 100 cavalry, and then 200,000 native allies. Well, we don't know these numbers. That's an estimate, but as opposed to the Aztecs, 80,000. So it was not a balanced campaign by any means. As I said before, the Aztecs and their allies had created this empire on the basis of tremendous brutality, and people were eager to get out from under the thumb of the Aztecs. They had no idea what was coming with the Spaniards. The other thing to note is that depopulation had already begun when the war was raging, that smallpox preceded Cortez. And so while this war was going on, what you can see here in the text that I've put in bold, the indigenous population at the time was devastated due to a smallpox epidemic which killed much of its leadership. So definitely a double or triple whammy, if you will. But that was just the beginning. So here's a pretty good graph showing depopulation of Mexico. Essentially, we're talking about South Central Mexico here, but that was the most densely populated part, with a population of maybe 22 million at the time of the arrival of the Spaniards. And then a quick drop-off due to about 8 million deaths from smallpox, and it's quite clear that it was smallpox. And then two more major epidemics, one in 1545 and one in 1576. The one in 1545, you can see it's most of the population disappearing in the span of a couple of years. Cocodlitzli is the term that the Nahua chroniclers, Nahua being the language of the Aztecs, what they refer to this disease in their own language. It was long thought to have been measles. Measles, very contagious disease. European populations had developed partial resistance to it, although not entire resistance. But the thought was that, just as in the case of smallpox, there was no resistance to these diseases by the indigenous populations because they had never been exposed to them. These diseases came to the Americas with the Spaniards. And so it's thought that measles could have done this. One of the problems is, though, the descriptions of this disease that was so devastating in these two epidemics doesn't really match measles all that well. So that is an issue. The other thing to note from this graph is how slowly the population rebounded. And it would eventually, but it's really not till the 1800s that it really starts to rebound. And it's much later that it reaches the kind of levels that you had before the Spaniards. Mesoamerica had been a densely populated area. It had some of the most sophisticated and productive agriculture in the world, which I will talk about. But at any rate, this, the nature of this second and third epidemic, Cocodlitzli, unknown. I think it's still not entirely decided, but a few years back there was an astounding discovery which indicates that it may well have been Salmonella bacteria. So here to quote from an article from 2018, scientists now say they have probably unmasked the culprit, analyzing DNA extracted from 29 skeletons buried in a cemetery from this disease, found traces of Salmonella enterica bacterium of a certain variety. Now, Salmonella is very common. It usually doesn't cause, well, it's often asymptomatic. You can see here it's a major cause of foodborne illness, food poisoning, probably, well, very often comes from Salmonella. People become infected most frequently from contaminated water or food, raw vegetables often. But as you can see in the text here, typically people have no symptoms, and others develop diarrhea, fever, abdominal cramps, and most healthy people recover within a few days. The fact that this might have killed many millions of people in Mesoamerica in the early 16th century would indicate people would have been severely unable to cope with it, and would indicate that peoples in Eurasia, Africa, who had long been exposed to salmonella would have developed some partial protection to it, immunity to it. So I think this is not at all decided, and future research is important, but a very intriguing and really kind of staggering finding if it indeed is true. Now, if we go to the Inca Empire, again, it wasn't their own term for it, but this was a very powerful state, very highly organized in the Andean mountains and plateau and coastal belt from Ecuador down into northern Argentina and Chile. It too had only grown in the 1400s, 15th century, and it too was in a period of crisis when the Spaniards came a few years after they had conquered the Aztec Empire. There had been a major civil war, and guess what? Smallpox was rapidly spreading before the Spaniards arrived. And these, this graph with the two lines, note it's just straight lines. It's very partial information, and not certainly not very accurate. But the general point is well taken of just this massive depopulation, and then what's showing here for the Incas, then sort of a stabilization, whereas it's showing for the Aztecs continual decline down to 1620. So it's not clear, but what is clear though is most of the people died, so that's pretty significant. And you could see again here, smallpox was first, but then there was probably a typhus outbreak. Typhus was some disease spread by human lice that often accompanied military campaigns in Europe. And then influenza, smallpox together, smallpox again, diphtheria, measles. So just one blow after another. An interesting article from 2011 based on a document for the time shows that the native Andean population in one valley in Peru showed a remarkable ability to bounce back from the initial Spanish invasion and smallpox epidemic. However, it was the repetition of such disasters generation after generation, along with overly rigid, that's one way of putting it, colonial administration that dramatically reduced the population over the long term. Now, it did not by any means wipe out the indigenous population. In fact, there was eventual recovery. And Quechua is the language of the Inca Empire, and today there are 8 to 10 million people who speak it as their first language. The map shows areas. The purple, the blue, the red, and the green are all different dialects of Quechua. Aymara is a very different language found in the Lake Titicaca area, the boundary between Bolivia and Peru, a language associated with pre-Columbian civilization, if you will. And today, Aymara has up to 2 million speakers. So these are significant languages. Certainly Quechua and Aymara are now official languages in Bolivia, along with Spanish and several other indigenous languages. This situation in Amazonia is equally complicated and interesting. The map here shows primary rainforests in areas where there's been a tremendous amount of loss. By 2020, actually, a lot of maps show much more extensive loss, so that could be underestimating it. But I put it in there because we usually think of the Amazon as what had been pristine rainforest with only a few scattered groups of primitive people, so-called primitive people, living in it. Recent research over the last few decades, though, have shown that it's a very different situation. So here's an article from a few years back from Smithsonian. The supposedly pristine, untouched Amazon was actually shaped by humans. that there had been a lot of people there, perhaps millions of people, who had been managing the landscape, farming it, creating soils, building dikes and ditches, and various means of controlling water and to maintain soils and highly productive agriculture. Certainly, there's a lot of evidence of large pre-colonial settlements along the big rivers of the Amazon. So this Portuguese map shows some of these in Brazil along the main stem of the Amazon and some of its major tributaries. Some of these were essentially cities, or at least close to it. The societies living here were usually not regarded as state level, with really sophisticated states, but not necessarily the case. We don't really know, because there was more destruction of these societies than was true in the case of true in the case of Mesoamerica or the Andean realm. So anyway, these were sizable, and a lot of evidence is being found. Some of it from aerial photographs, or now using LiDAR, various forms of remote sensing, to find these patterns in areas that today have very sparse population. A lot of these are along the south edge of the Amazon, which is sort of transitioning from rainforest to a tropical wet and dry savanna. They have very intensive, very wet seasons and quite dry seasons. And the evidence is showing that the peoples who had lived there were managing the seasonal flood and drying out through hydraulic engineering and establishing dikes and raised fields and the like, which would have supported pretty substantial population. So it's interesting here, this Science Alert article saying a hidden population up to 1 million thrived in, quote, uninhabited Amazonia. Well, very, very sparsely inhabited today. So again, here's one with LiDAR reveals network of pre-Hispanic settlements, with causeways and these earthworks with large fields and so on. And just to show you a map, as I said before, a lot of these are on the south side of the Amazon basin, so we could see that with the circle showing ceremonial centers or mounted ring villages, large platform mounds, fortified settlements, and all of these sort of issues. The other sites with just those black dots are mostly along the main rivers, which is where the larger settlements were found. Another important thing to note, especially in those areas near the rivers, was the fact that the indigenous people knew how to create very fertile and stable soils. So tropical rainforest areas, one might think they have very fertile soil because they have such lush and luxuriant vegetation, but all the nutrients are typically held in the plants themselves, in the wood and the leaves and so on. And the soil is generally very poor, really not suitable for agriculture. The only way to get a good crop in most parts of the Amazon is to cut down all the trees and burn it, and then you've got ash making fertile soil. But within a few years, insects and pests are going to multiply, plus the very heavy rain and warm temperatures will leach out the remaining nutrients, and until you've got almost nothing to go on. But then slowly over time, nutrients will build back up. But again, the nutrients are held in the vegetation. It said as soon as a leaf drops from a tree in the Amazon, it's going to decompose very rapidly, and the nutrients are going to go right back up into the trees. But you have these pockets of very dark, fertile soil. In Portuguese, it would be terra preta, also known as biochar soils. So these are human-made soils made by the indigenous inhabitants, and they're made by adding charcoal. So that's why they're called biochar soils. And unlike the normal the pre-existing soils, these terra preta biochar soils retain nutrients, and they do so because charcoal is hyperporous. It has all these incredible labyrinth of little nooks and crannies that nutrients will get in and remain in. And so these soils can maintain their fertility for maybe perhaps thousands of years. And they've been extensively mapped. I mean, they're still sought out today by farmers because of their fertility. And you could see here terra preta soils in those black circles, and they're generally along the rivers. An interesting thesis that came up a few years ago, 2000, well, a couple decades ago, I guess, was the idea that Amazonian depopulation and subsequent reforestation of the Amazon. So, I mean, there had always been tropical rainforests in parts of the Amazon, but maybe probably less than today. And after the depopulation, then the rainforest expanded to what we have thought of as sort of their natural range, but they hadn't been that large. But as that happened, you get massive tree growth, and trees take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and they sequester it in their wood. When the wood decomposes or is burned, it goes back into the atmosphere. But a lot of these are long-lived trees. So this is the idea that the Little Ice Age, which maybe first started late 1300s, 1400s, but really got going in the 1600s and 17th century. Perhaps, well, and we do know that carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere decreased at this time. So this thesis is that it was the depopulation followed by the reforestation, which sucked carbon out of the atmosphere and at a global scale was able to cause the Little Ice Age. There were a lot of headlines that in more popular publications that were a little more strongly worded, as is often the case, too strongly worded. So this one from the Telegraph: the Little Ice Age of the 16th and 17th centuries was triggered by the genocide of indigenous peoples by European settlers. That's well, that idea has been there, but it's quite strongly worded here. Now, no surprise, there has been some recent reassessment. Scholars are not certain this happened. Here's one more recent study, 2021, saying that the forest recovery began 300 to 600 years before the population crash. Well, that begs a lot of questions of why would the forest have been recovered if the population was still as large as it had been or growing. A lot of uncertainty. And in the last line that I've highlighted here, the cause of the CO2 decline in the Little Ice Age remains enigmatic. Yeah, indeed. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about the Americas. I will return to that part of the world in subsequent lectures. But what I want to move on to now is the effect of this Little Ice Age. And did the population of Europe decline from 1600 to 1650, and perhaps sort of plateau or level out for the world as a whole, largely because of the Little Ice Age? Well, there are a lot of things that were going on, and evidence does indicate, and scholars are pretty clear about this, is that from 1600 to 1650 or 1660 or so, Europe did see some population decline. But there are a variety of potential reasons for that. Also, there's a big question of, back up a little bit. There certainly was a European crisis in the 17th century or the 1600s. It didn't last through the whole century. By the last couple of decades, things were doing much better. I mean, you can look at the empire of Louis XIV in France, for example. That was sort of its high point, the period of the Sun King. But from 1620 to about 1650 were really rough decades in Europe. And it had a lot to do with war and conflict, but had partly to do with climate. I would recommend Jeffrey Parker's book, Global Crisis, War, Climate Change, and Catastrophe in the 17th Century, although I have to say it's kind of a tough read. He's quoting a lot of primary sources, and just the horrors and the dismal nature of his descriptions can be a bit hard to take. So anyway, there were a lot of political crises. I won't go into all of these, from the English Civil War, the Fronde, which was a civil war in France, rebellions against the Spanish crown. This is from the Wikipedia, looking at the general crisis, as it's sometimes called, which means that crisis of the early 1600s, but portraying it as due to political issues like a powerful centralizing bureaucratic princely states representing the court, and the traditional regional land-based aristocracy represented the country. Yeah, there's a lot to that. But these kind of conflicts were sort of always there. Why did they intensify here? Was it because of the Little Ice Age? Perhaps. And for population loss in Europe in this period, it's really important to note one conflict in particular, the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, that were in which the Habsburg Empire or Austrian Empire, whatever you want to call it, and its allies were fighting against France and Sweden. Other countries were involved. Very complicated wars. Actually, sort of 4 wars through this period of time. But these repeated instances of armies marching across the land, spreading diseases, eating the food, any time of climatic deterioration resulted in these massive population losses. And you can see for some areas over 50%, that's in the red, and the purple, 41 to 50, in the green, 31 to 40. I mean, those are large losses, and these are pretty good numbers. And we can look at other places. 17th century Spain, population declined, partly because that people were migrating to the Americas, but a lot of it had to do with bad harvests, outbreaks of the plague. Again, it's not gone. It's a lot of people dying. Now, it is important to note not every part of Europe was in crisis at this time. The real exception was the Netherlands. The period from 1600 to 1680 was really its high point. This was the Dutch Golden Age. We know it well from its art. I would highly recommend Simon Schama's The Embarrassment of Riches, looking at Dutch culture and economics during this period. So the question is, well, how was the Netherlands able to avoid this? It was largely because they had, not a monopoly, but a near monopoly over trade in Asia. This was their high point. They came into Asian waters in about 1600 and took over most of the trade routes that the Portuguese had previously controlled. They were very brutal in maintaining monopoly trade, in conquering isolated areas that they could use as their base, or areas that produced the really valuable goods like spices, nutmeg in particular. They were not above wiping out entire populations of people in areas that produce these spices, but it did bring a lot of wealth into the Netherlands at this time. So there were exceptions. Anyway, back to this question, to what extent was this, should be 17th century crisis, my mistake, crisis of the 1600s, to what extent was it caused by the Little Ice Age? And we have here the NASA Earth Observatory notes 3 particularly cold intervals, one beginning around 1650, and then there were others later on. But it was perhaps this first one that was the most devastating. It's favored by many global and environmental historians, but I think the jury is still out. But anyway, we could see with the reconstructed temperatures, we could see definitely a decline in temperature in Europe from the medieval warm period, but then also more variability. And there were certainly some very cold episodes, both in winter, very cold and cool summers. That's demonstrated a lot in art. So you can see this is from late 1500s, but we have a landscape with snowfall near Antwerp and what is now Belgium. In the Netherlands, rivers and canals routinely froze for a month. The Thames River froze for long periods of time in England, and these things that don't happen these days much at all. Anyway, debates about what are the cause, a lack of sunspots. And you can see on this graph the Maunder minimum from 1650 to about 1700. Although one important thing to note is by 1680, things are really looking up. Politically, the worst part is right in the middle of that century. But these minimum periods of sunspots are associated with less solar radiation. And there's evidence of volcanism, which often comes up as well. And there are also big debates over how much the Little Ice Age was a European phenomenon or a phenomenon across the temperate belts, especially of the northern hemisphere. It doesn't really seem to have maybe been a global thing. It may have hit Northern Europe much harder than other places, although there's a lot of evidence it hit China pretty hard as well. But we have central England here. It's reconstruction by H. Lamb, who was one of the pioneering historians of climate, who did things like look at records of monasteries, say when harvests occurred or when water froze or these sort of things to try to reconstruct this. And here you can see a real dip in the late 1600s. Also, there's some speculation that the little ice age results in the weakening of the Gulf Stream, which brings warm water up from the Caribbean. It cools as it heads north, but it really moderates the climate of Northern Europe. Just look at a map and compare the latitude of Ireland, say, go across the Atlantic, and you're in central Canada, very, very cold places, much colder. And there's a lot of concern about the Gulf Stream possibly failing or reducing as global warming occurs. So there's speculation that you could actually have a period of much colder conditions in Europe as the globe as a whole warms up. But again, I'll emphasize a lot of uncertainty here. But anyway, if we ask ourselves how global was it, it does seem to have had major effects in China. So just to quote from this article here, we have identified 3 principal ways in which climate change contributed to the collapse of the Ming Dynasty that occurred in 1644. So first it's cooling, aridification or drying, and desertification during a cold period, which destroyed the military farm system, which was the main supply system for provisioning government troops on the northern frontiers. And the Ming Dynasty fell because it was conquered by the Manchus, who created the Qing Empire, but they were not ethnic Chinese. They came from the northeastern China, sometimes called Manchuria. Anyway, you can see that military expenditures rose from 64% of total government expenditures to 76% in the late 1500s. And then reduction in per capita grain, again, severe droughts, peasant uprisings. So China really weakened in this period, partly by these climate conditions, allowing the Manchus from the north to come in and conquer it. So again, this Manchus became a very powerful dynasty, arguably the most powerful, and they did become a Chinese-style dynasty, adopted the Chinese term Qing, but the rulers of that dynasty were always ethnic Manchus and not ethnic Chinese. And just a little more information on the disasters that were occurring about this time. The traditional Confucian explanation was that the Ming Dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven, which is the notion that heaven meaning sort of the supernatural realm or the realm beyond Earth is going to bestow its mandate on empires that function according to Confucian norms, and if they don't, that mandate is withdrawn. It's a lot like the will of God in traditional European thought. But anyway, the Manchu conquest of China was extremely important. You could see the Manchu homeland in that very, very dark area north of Korea, and then its expansion. Ultimately, the Manchus included all of Manchuria, not just Manchuria, but almost all of Mongolia, Tibet, Xinjiang, or eastern Turkestan in the far northwest of China, creating a larger Chinese, if you will, empire than had previously existed. Also, since we're on demography, I would note that research has shown a huge reproductive success from early Manchu leaders. You can do this because of markers on the Y chromosome. You get a few mutations and you can trace those out. And so here's indicating that the grandfather of the founder of this Qing dynasty, this huge number of descendants, take that as you will, Anyway, this is a very stylized, exaggerated, and Malthusian view of Chinese population growth and decline. But it serves the point that I want to emphasize. And I'll talk later on about Malthusian explanations, and particularly as they are applied to China. But this is the notion that you have good periods, stable politically, maybe stable climatically, and the population of China goes way up. Then you have overpopulation, you have a crisis, you have rebellions, you have invasions, the population drops down, then you have restabilization, and it increases. So that's very simplified, but there may be something to it. We could look at other graphs that show it quite differently. Here's one. And I put a red oval around that transition from the Ming to the Qing dynasty, and it's showing a drop-off, but not a huge one. Just as it's showing a drop-off at the end of the Song dynasty. It's not really showing one at the end of the Tang dynasty at all. And then I'll talk later on about the huge increase that occurred in China's population after about 1700, but that will be in a later lecture. One last thing I want to note is that, and this is something I will return to a lot, the issue of Malthusianism with overpopulation. The population becomes too large for local resources. There's going to be some sort of crisis and population decline. And that had certainly, arguably anyway, I should say, occurred in Europe when the Black Death came in. As I argued in a previous lecture, a lot of evidence that Europe was overpopulated in 1350, and things were becoming difficult in terms of food provisioning and timber and many other things. And then populations were weakened, the plague came in, population greatly reduced, which led to economic recovery. But in Europe, in this terrible period in the 1600s, mid-1600s, it was a population decline, but it was not a huge one. There was plague coming around at that time, and a lot of people died from it, but you didn't get this kind of catastrophe. It wasn't long-lived. It was short-lived, and there was quick recovery. I will occasionally refer to Kenneth Pomerantz' very interesting and provocative book on the Great Divergence, which seeks to explain why China in particular and Europe diverged and when that divergence happened. So China had been a very strong, powerful state all the way up to about 1820, and then it had a sort of a near collapse and had a century of humiliation under European domination, and Europe just was growing stronger and stronger. But the one point I want to make here to end this lecture is one advantage that Europe had over China was an ability to draw on resources from across the Atlantic. It wasn't really drawing a whole lot of things like grain yet. That would eventually happen. They were getting timber for shipbuilding at a pretty early stage, but one thing that was happening by 1500 already, maybe even earlier, maybe before Columbus, was European fishers were going to the Grand Banks off the coast of eastern Canada, which was along the world's greatest fishery. So you had the warm Gulf Stream and the cold Labrador Current coming together, quite shallow water, mixing up the nutrients at the bottom of the ocean, supporting very, very productive food chains, and particularly one fish, the cod, just in tremendous abundance here. And it's thought that already, like I say, by 1500, several European countries were exploiting this. And the cod were not only tremendously abundant, they are also very easily processed. It's not an oily fish. It could be, the fish could be dried and easily exported. And this was a lot of high quality protein going to Europe from across the Atlantic from an earlier period. And eventually Europe is going to be drawing on resources from all over the world to help support its population. I would greatly recommend Mark Kurlansky's book on cod. He's not a scholar, he's a journalist, but journalists often do tremendously good jobs at explaining historical patterns and processes. And in a number of his books, he's taken single commodities, one on salt, here's one on cod. and just showing, how important it was. So I think it's a really fun book to read, and I greatly recommend it. And then the last thing I will mention is that this tremendous resource, which helped feed Europe all the way up into the late 20th century, is now essentially gone. So you could see cod had been fished in a fairly sustainable manner starting around 1960. Cod began to be exploited in an unsustainable manner with just huge trawlers just taking out all the cod. Population crash, and all efforts to restrict fishing and bring the cod back have failed. I mean, there's some there, but it's essentially a dead fishery, partly because other species will come in and supplant them, and even though the nutrients are there, the cod fishery has not been able to be recreated. So a real lesson in unsustainable exploitation of a natural resource. Thank you for listening in, and I will continue talking about historical demographic patterns in the next couple of lectures. Thank you.